I told my 4.5-year-old daughter that I was coming to speak to 3,000 organic farmers, and she was very impressed. So I really am thrilled to be here, and it's such a pleasure to be here. And I don't know many of you, but those who I do know out there in the audience, I consider some of my dearest friends. And I wanted to begin with just to kind of paint you a scene slightly different maybe than the Moses Conference. And it was a couple of years ago, I had gone to the first ever sustainability summit for the Grocery Manufacturers Association. So a little different maybe than some of the vibe around here. And there was moments, that really felt straight out of the pages of Orwell. So going to a presentation, for instance, from an executive from Coca-Cola who was just so proudly sharing how the company had massively reduced the amount of water it now took to make bottled water, right? So, I thought, yes, it is good that but do we really, need to be drinking Dasani water? Not so sure. But what really struck me was this one moment in one of the sessions. So it was a workshop about how big companies, Anheuser-Busch and other big companies, were reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. And during the Q&A, an executive from one of the workshop attendees raised his hand, and he said, you know what? Joe Consumer is really starting to care about where their food comes from and how it was made. But they just want to feel like we're doing something about it. They don't really care about the details. And I actually physically bit my tongue to stop from jumping up and saying, what are you talking about? That's not true at all. But I didn't say anything then. But I think, as I would guess, almost every single one, if not every single one of you knows, that is not true. Consumers, all of us, eaters, whatever word you want to call us who consume food, human beings, I think we don't just want to feel like something is changing, we want to know it is. And we want to trust it is. And I feel that sense of that desire to really know, really multiplying, and you can feel it in terms of the people turning out to farmers markets across the country, the people that are coming to your farms, that are buying from you, the people who got outraged across the country when we found that pink slime was in school food lunch meat, right? We're hearing this again and again and again. It's not that we want to feel it, it's that we really want to know it. And as I started exploring, more and more about the true facts about how our food was produced, I found myself kind of starting to dig into the literature on the connections between food production, and the climate crisis. And I have to say, I was a bit shocked by what I discovered. And for me to be shocked about anything about food is actually, I think, kind of impressive, seeing as Faye mentioned, I was raised by Frances Moore Lappé, who, starting from before the time I could walk, was kind of indoctrinating me into her work and bringing me to, stuff envelopes for her nonprofit fundraising initiatives and, having me go out to meet farmers in the fields. And so I was learning a lot about food from an early age. My father was a toxicologist, and often he would come home to family dinners telling us about the heartbreaking stories of meeting farm workers who had gotten ill and sick from pesticides on their land. So I feel like I had sort of heard a lot about what wasn't working so well in terms of food and agriculture. But the more I learned about the food and global warming connection, the more shocked I became. And what I learned, which is what I think many of you know in the work that you do, is that there is this direct connection between how we are producing our food in the industrial food chain and global warming, one of the biggest environmental crises of our time, if not the biggest crisis our species has ever faced. What we know is that this industrial food chain is responsible for about 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions. I've even seen some estimates as high as 50%, but I like to be conservative on this and say 30%. So you start digging into the why of that. Well, why? What's driving that? And what you find when you start asking that question is you start peeling out those layers, and you start seeing these irrational, absolutely irrational decisions that we are making with so much of our food chain. So you start discovering, for instance, the fact that we are plowing down rainforests in Brazil, the rainforests that are really the lungs of the planet. We are plowing down those rainforests to plant feed crop for livestock being raised in factory farms in China. So now 80% of Brazil's greenhouse gas emissions are coming from that destroyed rainforest and those commodity crop production facilities. You start discovering irrational things like the fact that we are now seeing incredibly carbon-rich peatland in Indonesia and Malaysia being destroyed, essentially creating a carbon bomb in those countries for oil palm plantations. Well, why? Why is palm oil becoming such a big commodity, the fastest growing vegetable oil in the world? Why? So that processed foods can stay on the shelf longer. So that the American consumer can open up a can of supermarket peanut butter and not have to stir that peanut butter with their knife because palm oil makes it creamy. I mean, that to me doesn't seem like the highest priority for peanut butter, but maybe that's just me. So you're starting to see just this irrationality about how we have structured our food that's causing these greenhouse gas emissions. You start seeing things like the choices that are being made about food trade and about how much transportation is involved in so much of food trade. One of my favorite examples on this, which to me just like almost makes my head hurt in terms of its not being the most rational way of organizing our food, is what happens with factory farm salmon now off the coast of the Northwest in the United States. We have factory farm salmon being fed on feed, fish feed, and also some commodity crops, but fish feed, fish that are grown off the coast of Chile, shipped to the Northwest to feed the salmon. So salmon takes about 7 pounds of feed to make 1 pound of salmon. And then you're flash freezing that salmon, shipping it to China, where it's being deboned because the labor is cheaper in China to do that, and then being shipped back to the United States and shipped out across the country to be sold in American supermarkets. And labeled made in the USA because technically it was raised off the coast of in the Northwest. So you're talking about, think about the irrationality of that system and all of the emissions that are connected to that transportation story. And then you start thinking about the irrationality of food waste in our industrial food system. Some of you may have seen the new USDA study on food waste, kind of the definitive study that found that in the United States today, we are wasting 1,249 calories per capita per day of food that could be eaten. That's $161 billion of food being wasted. And you can think of that in terms of all of the greenhouse gas emissions that were then wasted in producing that food that ultimately isn't getting used. You can think about it in terms of all of the emissions that are getting wasted as the food rots in landfills. Or you could think about it as the wasted opportunity to feed people 1,249 calories of food a day. You could also think about it in terms of, how often do you hear, but people, we just can't afford to pay more for food. We can't afford to pay that marginal higher cost for organic food. When it is more expensive, it can be more expensive, although it's not always. But then you think, well, we are wasting $161 billion worth of food every year. So as I started learning more and understanding more about the irrationality of this industrial food system that is such a direct cause of global warming, I started reframing my own understanding of what it means to be a farmer and a sustainable farmer. So I had often just thought of farmers as, the most vital people who are providing me health and helping me raise healthy children. Yes, that is very important. And then I started realizing, and also farmers are at the very front lines of ensuring that either we have more global greenhouse gas emissions or we stabilize emissions and we have farmers who could be truly climate heroes. Because what we're discovering, in which many of you are involved in these studies to prove, is what organic farming can do for the land and can do for the climate. We know that greenhouse gas emissions on organic farms are much lower than industrial farms. Of course, we know the difference in terms of petrochemical use. We know from multi-year studies that organic farms have much higher soil carbon content, and you all know this from the work you do in your fields. We know, of course, that the work you do as organic farmers promotes and protects biodiversity, exactly what we need in the face of more climate instability. And so I started having this real kind of mental shift in my own mind as a big advocate of organic food, which is that, it's not just organic farming, it's climate smart farming, it's climate wise farming. That when we think about what do we need to be doing as a country to really be part of the climate solution, that food policy should be part of that conversation. That promoting and supporting new and beginning farmers, promoting and supporting organic farming should be part of that conversation, not separate to it. So the more I learned, the more excited I became, and even more of an advocate have I become about organic food. And I was in one of my sort of moments of just being so excited by the tremendous number of organic farmers that I was starting to get connected to, having recently moved back to the San Francisco Bay Area, and the access I have to organic food. And I walked into my local supermarket with my 4.5-year-old daughter and my 2-year-old daughter. We walked into our supermarket, and this is in Berkeley, California. It has a huge organic section. And I'm walking in, and I pass by 2 women standing next to the organic section. And I hear one of them say to the other, didn't you see that Stanford University study? It's really not worth it to pay more for organic food. And I found myself almost biting my tongue like I did at that Grocery Manufacturers Association meeting and not saying anything. And then I said, I can't not say anything. I said, excuse me, I hate to interrupt, and I hate to have just eavesdropped on your conversation. I hate to interrupt, but I really want you to know that actually the media really misinformed the public when they represented what the data showed in that Stanford study. And that if you really look at what the research shows, and even what the research in that own Stanford study showed, it showed that there is demonstrable difference between eating organic food and non-organic food, and that the pesticide residues that you find on non-organic food are statistically significant, and that is why I am taking my 2 kids and walking into the organic section. Now, do I think that I persuaded those 2 women to change their mind? I hope so. There's no guarantee. But it was just one of those moments where my kind of enthusiasm bubble burst, and I was reminded of what we are up against in terms of the messaging that is getting out there about organic food and farming, about the small farms movement, and about the role organic food plays in both a healthy diet and also in terms of climate stability. And I started thinking about, why is it that so many people, like those women in that Berkeley supermarket were questioning organic food? Why is that happening? What is it that we're up against? And I started looking into kind of this vast world of media and communications developed by proponents of conventional agriculture to really try to denigrate the benefits of organic agriculture, and this kind of growth of these front groups that have really nice sounding names, but they're really out there, I think, to confuse the public. So you have groups, maybe you've heard about this one, groups like the one called the Alliance to Feed the Future, which sounds great. I'm all for feeding the future, but you dig into who's funding the Alliance to Feed the Future and its communications campaigns, and you discover that some of its biggest contributors are groups like the National Association for Dressings and Sauces, the National Frozen Pizza Institute, so you get the idea. And so I felt called upon to think about how can we do an even better job to not just speak to each other about the benefits of organic food and farming and sustainable farming, but how can we speak even more loudly together to a more diverse audience. And so I brought together a coalition of really fabulous food and farming organizations. Some of them are here, groups like Land Stewardship Project and many others, and created the Real Food Media Project to try to get this story out, both all the benefits of organic food and farming, the climate benefits, the health benefits, the economic benefits, the community benefits. And we started the Real Food Media Project We started creating what we called myth-busting movies, taking on big myths like the biggest of all, that we need chemical farming to feed the world, despite what the Alliance to Feed the Future says. Our movies have been watched almost 1 million times so far. And then we wanted to open up that conversation to encourage other people to be telling the story about organic and sustainable food and farming. So we launched a short films contest, and this was our first year running the contest. And we were so pleased that we got 156 films submitted from 32 states and 5 countries. And having watched those 156 films, if any of you are ever feeling despondent, if you're out there in the fields wondering if there's anybody else who cares about what you're doing, I will invite you over to watch 156 movies to tell you that you are not alone. These were incredible stories, totally moving, totally inspirational, again, from all around the country. And what I experienced in watching these movies is that sense that, yes, we are not alone. It can feel like we are sometimes, but we are not. And my mother and I, we like to kind of riff off of this metaphor that sometimes she and I, when we do this work together, we have those moments where, you sometimes wonder what impact you're having. And we were talking about it one day, and we were saying, sometimes you hear that expression that you feel like you're just a drop in the bucket. Right? That what difference is any of this really making? We're just that drop in a bucket. And she and I were talking about that metaphor, and it just so happened we were having this conversation on a very rainy night in Seattle, Washington. And we started thinking about a bucket, and we started thinking about some drops of rain, and we started realizing that if you are a drop in a bucket, and it's raining a lot, that bucket can fill up, and that bucket can fill over and spill over. That I think so much of our despondency comes not from feeling like we're a drop in the bucket, but from feeling like we're a drop in the desert. That, our drop doesn't even touch ground, it just evaporates. And so when I was watching those 156 films, what I was really feeling was I was feeling like I was seeing a bucket. I was feeling the sense that we are not these disparate drops that aren't affecting at all. We are drops that are forming together. And I think this conference is such a beautiful expression of that, right? And so our work, partly as communicators about the work that we do, is to help people to see that bucket. Because once you do, that sense of futility, that sense of being alone in this work goes away, and that sense of possibility starts to emerge. That sense that you could be the first drop in that bucket, or you could be the last drop in that bucket. Your drop could be what sends it over the edges, right? And when people ask me this question about, okay, Anna, so you see, what's happening with our food and agriculture system. You see, for instance, the news that we might have 2,4-D resistant corn and soy approved, and that would, by some estimates, increase the use of 2,4-D across cropland in this country by 20-fold by 2019. That you hear things like that, right? And you think about the climate crisis, you think about how we are not averting it, we are not really investing where we need to invest. And I get often asked, well, so are you optimistic or are you pessimistic about the future? And I like to say neither. I like to say there is a third option. And that third option is to be a possibilist. A possibilist. That's what my mother likes to call herself. It's what I like to call myself. It's what I think all of you are. And when you start thinking about what does it mean to be a possibilist, well, it means that you don't have the hubris to think you know what's going to happen in the future, right? To be a pessimist, it means you think you can predict the future and that it's going to be bad. But to be a possibilist means that you hold yourself open to possibility that you could never imagine. And having been in the world and steeped in this world of understanding food systems for now more than a decade, what I keep finding myself coming up against is that sense of possibility. Is right when I thought something couldn't be possible, something convinces me otherwise. So I think about, for instance, when I first moved to New York City in the mid-1990s, I ended up living there for almost 15 years. When I first moved there, if someone had told me that by the time I had my first child, there would be more than 100 community-supported agriculture farms across every borough in the city, supplying tens of thousands of New Yorkers with fresh, organic produce every week, I would have said, I don't think that's possible. And yet there I was, more than 10 years later, having my first child, and becoming a part of one of these CSAs that were started by this organization called Just Food that now supply tens of thousands of New Yorkers and gave mothers like me the opportunity to have my daughter's very first taste of raspberries, zucchini, squash, pumpkin, apples, plums, tomatoes, broccoli, cauliflower, on and on and on, to have her first taste of all of those foods come from an organic farmer who lived an hour and a half away from my apartment in Brooklyn. And when I think about possibility, I think about your own story, about the Moses story of what you've been able to create from 25 years ago, 90 people coming to this conference to today. You're bursting at the seams here. And I think about the movies that I mentioned that I saw. So, story after story, unpredictable stories, like a community in the South Bronx that's come together to create a school garden with young people who, before they got involved with that school garden, had literally never tasted a vegetable that wasn't inside 2 hamburger buns, and are now growing food for their 450 kids in their high school and have enough that they're giving away to the food bank in the South Bronx. So I think about stories like that, and I have that sense of possibility. And as I close and turn it over to Mark, I want to say that I think that as we think about what is it that this time calls upon us to do, I think it calls upon us to not bite our tongue, to speak up, whether it's in those small ways in the grocery store next to someone who's trying to decide, did they buy the organic apple or did they not? And then in big ways like speaking up to the EPA and the USDA about how we feel about 2,4-D, genetically engineered 2,4-D resistant corn and soy, how we work together to speak more loudly and more powerfully about all of the benefits of what every single one of you is doing, not just in the preventative medicine, which is so important that Melinda talked about, not just in helping me feed my children, but also in the absolutely essential work of protecting our planet's climate. So thank you. And before I turn it over to Mark, I do want to give the last word to my 4.5-year-old daughter, because I did ask her yesterday morning when I was packing her off to school and telling her I was coming here. I said, well, Ida, what would you say? What would you say to the farmers? And she said, tell them, it's going to make me cry to say it. She said, tell them, thank you for the food. So, thank you. So I want to bring Mark up, and I know many of you know him, and I just want to tell you a little story about my first time meeting Mark. So I was on the road doing research for my latest book on food and climate called Diet for a Hot Planet, a little riff off my mother's Diet for a Small Planet. And I was meeting with Organic Valley farmers in Wisconsin here, and somebody suggested that I should just really talk to Mark Shepard. So I said, okay, I added him into my schedule. And I was going out to visit Mark's farm. This was a number of years back when the state had just been hit by that terrible, terrible flood, devastating farmers, costing the state and farmers millions and millions of dollars. So I'm driving out to Mark's farm in my little rental car, and as I'm driving out to his farm, I'm passing by farmland that literally looks like lakes, and I'm seeing these gullies that have been carved out of the sides of farm fields. And I am bracing myself to meet a devastated farmer. And I'm thinking, you know, what could be more rude than trying to do research and ask this farmer a bunch of questions when he's, you know, barely making it because he's just been devastating by this flood. But I say, okay, you know, I'm going to be very sympathetic, and I'm excited to meet him and, you know, and learn about what he's doing. So I pull up into his driveway, and it felt, you know, very, it felt like out of a film, because as I'm pulling in, right then, kind of the clouds parted in the sky. I'm serious. It happened this way. And the sun sort of kind of beaming down right onto the deck of Mark's cider house, where he and one of his farm interns were lounging on, if I remember correctly, hammocks, although I might have been making this up. But my memory is they were, you know, lounging on hammocks, very relaxed. This did not look like the face of a devastated farmer. And so my very first question to Mark when I first met him was, you know, how is your farm? You know, how did you fare? Are you doing okay? And Mark said, you know, we lost, I think it was the green peppers. There was, you know, maybe, you know, one field that got, you know, a bit waterlogged. But he said, actually, the rest of the farm's okay. And he said, you know, some of my crops have never been better. And for the rest of my time that I spent that day with Mark, I spent learning about what he was doing on his farm to create the kind of resilience that meant that his farm could weather such a terrible storm and come out even stronger than before. So I learned a lot from Mark that one day, and from the connection we've had over the years, as I know many of you have had having him in your midst. And I'm really excited to now turn the stage over to Mark and learn from him some more. So thank you.